We have a wonderful panel of folks tonight, all of whom have been involved in the creation of the new, and some people the former issues of Our Bodies, Ourselves. They come from a wide variety of experiences and expertise and perspectives, and some of them have traveled quite a far distance to be with you tonight. And they're all, I don't know, I like to think they're all sort of heroic in their own way. And I'm going to get to tell you a little bit about each one of them, starting right next to me with Wendy Sanford, who has been a member of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective for 35 years. And served as co-author editor of all previous editions of Our Bodies, Ourselves. As she looks back, she especially delights in her work on the body image, sexuality, and lesbian chapters, as well as her efforts to strengthen the book through the inclusion of disability issues in the 80s and trans issues in the 90s. She's excited about this new version written by so many younger women and looks forward to hearing from them this evening. Please welcome Wendy.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm really delighted to be here tonight representing the founders of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, and I'm also still the only lesbian in the collective, despite what all the early critics thought we must all be lesbians. It even took us a while to get one. So I brought to show you, and I want to quote a little bit from the very first book, which was actually called Women in Their Bodies until we realized that was a really distancing title and we changed it to Our Bodies, Ourselves. But this was the very first book that came out in 1970. And the part about that we're talking about tonight, you know, lesbian, bisexual, trans issues was in a page and a half called Homosexuality. And it was very tentative and kind of by report, and I just wanted, but it was a start. So I wanted to read you two lines from it. One is, a woman we know who recently had a love affair with her friend said it was the first time she felt like an equal in bed. So none of us had ever done this, but we knew a couple of people who had. So, and then another line from page 34. Sexually acceptable heterosexual encounters have been so destructive that some of us may just decide to chuck the whole thing and express our love and sexuality with each other. So it was like, we wish, we hope, we want to be free to do this. It was all very kind of hopeful. And then when the book was going to be published by a commercial press in New York, we realized we needed a chapter on lesbians, and none of us had that experience. So there was a group of women from this very area who wrote a chapter called In America They Call Us Dykes. And I think it's the best lesbian chapter we've ever had, and it's certainly the most intense, the most romantic, the most groundbreaking, the most revolutionary. So many people have written to say that book really saved their sense of themselves as whole people. I mean, that chapter did. And we got a lot of letters about that chapter, but since we didn't really know what to say in answering them, the Women's Center in Boston, in Cambridge, right across the street, took that up and answered every single letter for a period of 10 or 15 years. Every letter that women from all over the country wrote in, saying how the chapter had impacted them and asking questions and stuff like that. So I really want to honor Judy Norris and others at the Women's Center who did that. I want to honor Tess and Marla and the many other wonderful dykes who worked on that first. In America, they call us dykes. And then we finally got a lesbian. Which was me, and I had been so nervous when the women who were writing In America They Call Us Dykes came over to meet with our group. I'd sit pretty far away from them, but not across from them, because then they might look at me and see something I didn't want to know. So anyway, I did, in this very room, in 25 and a half years ago, Adrienne Rich spoke here about racism and women. And I was in the audience, and I looked around at all the lesbians I knew from everything else I went to, and that was the night I said to myself, okay, I get it. So it's wonderful to be back here talking. And so in 1984, a group of us got together to revise the chapter, and it really changed. We decided there were some wonderful, there's wonderful stuff out there by lesbians. By then we had New Words Bookstore, we had a lot of women's presses, and so we decided to make a less passionate, more informative chapter. For better or for worse, that's what we did. And so we were really learning that you can't say we and mean all women if you're white, middle-class women. So we tried to do a chapter that just had a lot more voices in it. And we had a whole section called We Are Everywhere. We had mothers in it, and lesbians of color, and older women, and lesbians with disabilities. And it was a more wide-ranging, although less intense and passionate chapter. And I want to honor Peggy Lynch, who worked on the health part of that chapter and many subsequent chapters and did a beautiful job. And the question she raised that I wanted to bring tonight is kind of a debate that I think probably still isn't answered, is are there specific lesbian health problems, or are there health problems lesbians have because we're women, but that are accentuated and made more problematic by the way the healthcare system treats first women, and then lesbians, and then trans people. So that's a question that she introduced. And then I just got a couple more things. In the 90s, we introduced much more about bisexuals, and bisexual women started writing, kind of coming out in the book. And then when we did the edition for the late 90s, which I was a senior editor for, I had read Stone Butch Blues a few years before and was just deeply, deeply struck by that book. And I knew we had to get trans issues into our book. And so I wrote this little teeny chapter that Elizabeth has made really long and really good, but at least worked some bit of consciousness into the book. So that's very important to me. And so from the chapter on homosexuality, to America they call us dykes, then the 80s, Loving Women, Lesbian Life and Relationships, which is still one of my favorite titles. And now it's called Relationships with Women, for reasons that maybe the other folks will explain. But I'm really happy to be here, and now I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Lindsay. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Wendy. Classy Wendy. I wanted to say also that I should have said more about the format. Each of the panelists is going to talk in the way that Wendy just has and give you some context, and then we're going to give you all a chance to talk both amongst yourselves, and then all of us together are going to have a larger conversation. So that's the larger agenda for the evening. So now we're going to move from Wendy with the great grounding history of how we got here to Elizabeth, who's responsible for the brand new chapter. Elizabeth Sarah Lindsay is a 24-year-old African-American femdyke who currently lives in Philadelphia. She wrote the new chapter on sexual orientation and gender identity in the new edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves. A 2002 graduate of Swarthmore College, Elizabeth currently works in fund development at Maternity Care Coalition, a Philadelphia nonprofit. She's also trained as a sexual health educator at Planned Parenthood, Southeastern Pennsylvania, and serves on the board of directors of WAVE, a women and trans self-defense organization. This fall, she'll begin studies towards a master's in public affairs from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. Elizabeth is most passionate, however, about creating community and fighting for liberation with other queer and trans people of color. Please welcome Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks a lot. So, as Jacqueline just mentioned, I wrote the new chapter in Our Bodies, Ourselves on sexual orientation and gender identity. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about some of the main themes that I thought were important in my chapter. My first goal in the chapter is really making clear that our gender is not connected to our biological sex. And while to me and to a lot of trans people this seems pretty obvious, I think for a lot of people this isn't so obvious. So I tried to really make it applicable to everyone, and to really make it clear that people have choices when it comes to their gender, and that their gender and the way they dress, the way they talk, their whole their whole being is not connected to their biological sex. So that was one major point of my work. A second issue that I thought was really important is that Our Bodies Ourselves has always billed itself as a book for women by women. And as we move into the 21st century, I felt like it was necessary to kind of think about who is this woman that Our Bodies Ourselves is geared to, and what exactly do we mean when we say this is a book for women? And I felt like it was crucial, as did many of the people I worked with on the chapter, to make the definition of woman as broad as possible for this book. So in my work and throughout the book, I've kind of defined woman. I haven't actually defined woman, but I've kind of geared my work towards anyone who has or ever or continues to identify or live as a woman. So this is inclusive of trans people and non-trans people. And I did a few things that hopefully I think made my chapter more inclusive to a wide range of people. In addition to giving some basic definitions on different kinds of trans identities, I also really tried to incorporate voices of people from across the gender spectrum. So I actually ended up receiving many, many responses to an email that I sent out, over 200 actually, from trans and genderqueer and non-trans people across the country sharing their stories with me. And so I really tried to incorporate their voices throughout. For example, if there's a section in the section on coming out, I have a really poignant story of someone who identifies as an F to M coming out to his mother. So that was something that I feel really proud of in this work. I also tried to address homophobia, heterosexism, and transphobia throughout the chapter. And one of the most striking things to me in terms of the responses that I received is that I received a number of responses from trans women who experienced isolation and rejection from lesbian communities that they tried to enter into. So I think that's something that queer women, queer non-trans women, definitely moving forward need to work on, and I also tried to include that into my work too. What else? I really tried to talk about the differences in what coming out looks like to different communities. I think in today's political climate, we oftentimes see coming out as looking like the characters on Will and Grace, white middle-class gay people who come out, automatically have a great community, can wear a rainbow pin, can have access to all these different resources. In reality, that's not the experience for most queer and trans people. So I tried hard to find stories from queer people of color and queer and trans people of color who have found different ways of coming out, or that coming out looks different. It might mean having a specific queer community of color with whom you can be yourself, but in your work life, your professional life, in your family, in your church, whatever, that you are not out in a traditional mainstream way. I also really found through my stories and was reminded that homophobia and transphobia are still rampant in the United States, and I tried to make that clear as well, because I think it's really easy for me, I live in Philadelphia, I have a very strong queer community, to forget that, and that people are really isolated and people are really struggling still. And that's part of the reason I'm really proud to have worked on this book, because I think it's a resource that is pretty widespread that people can have access to. And I know Shannon's going to talk about it. We just developed a companion website too, so hopefully even people who don't have the book can find these resources. So I'm just really excited to be here and excited to contribute. I'm also looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. And I just feel great to hopefully remind people that being able to get married is not the major concern for most queer and trans people in the U.S. So, thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next up, we're going to hear from Shannon Burning, who is an editor for an independent book publisher focusing on nonfiction in the areas of health, parenting, self-help, biography, film, and politics, and is co-president of Women in Publishing, a social professional networking organization that connects and encourages women in the trade book industry. Shannon revised the chapter on relationships with women and wrote content on queer teen dating and lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex health concerns for the Companion website, which we'll hear about. She was previously managing editor of Teen Voices, a national magazine written by, for, and about teenage women, and she lives in Brooklyn, New York. Shannon.
Hi, you'll have to let me know if you have any trouble hearing me. Good? Okay, thanks. So it's such an honor to be here tonight. It's great to be with other people who may have contributed to the book and other people who hopefully will read it and learn from it and help to expand it for the next revision. So I had the pleasure of working on the chapter titled Relationships with Women, and it was quite a huge task because I had basically the last time it had been revised was in 1998, as Wendy talked about, and I really wanted to honor the experiences and the work that so many women had done before me, but also take a look at just how much has happened in the last several years. And it really has been a huge difference in how we're perceived throughout the United States and even the world. So just to give a little background, the 1998 edition really encompassed everything in a way about all things lesbian and bisexual and a little bit transgender in terms of basically going on. It dealt with coming out, how to find our communities, sexuality, relationships, raising children, health and medical care, and even our legal rights, our individual civil rights. So it covered a broad spectrum. And in the last several years, it became clear that it's time that the entire book should address our experiences and our identities in terms of that the parent, the section about motherhood or about fertility should include our experiences as well. And so the coming out material went to the chapter that Elizabeth worked on, and the health and medical material went to other parts of the book. And so it was very exciting. So what we were left with was focusing on relationships. And so that was a very difficult thing to look at from my perspective. I've been in relationships with men and women, and from that perspective, I thought, oh, gee, what's different? I'm not sure how much is different. And I'd read the relationship with men chapter and thought, intimacy is an issue for all of us. So really where we went was to look at very queer-specific relationship issues for lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. So we looked at how to meet people, how to find community, how our identities when we're single, teen dating, which is very important, which is gone beyond just coming out, but also that queer teens are dating. Honoring our differences, which we haven't always sort of acknowledged within the various communities, and then how to navigate homophobia and heterosexism in our relationships, and a variety of other things, including looking at our commitments and about what those look like and what we want to call them, and just in terms of looking at the whole marriage issue, that was a fun thing to sort of try to deal with, because you want it to be relevant over the long term, but obviously things are happening every day. So it was quite a challenge, and I think in the beginning I really wanted to defer to the history there that I really respected, but initial feedback from people who were very familiar with the book said, hey, we need to go further, we need to really expand things. So it was a really exciting opportunity, and to do that, I thought, I'm just one person, so I reached out to all the people that we called pre-readers, people who read the 1998 edition and said, this is where you need to go. And then after I revised the chapter, there were post-readers who said, okay, this is where what you still need to include in the chapter. So there was a lot of feedback. And then in addition, I reached out, like Elizabeth had, online and received more than 100 personal stories from women about their relationship and health concerns. And that was critical in deciding what direction to go in with a number of the issues. So because the book was reduced in a way, we were able to refer, and because now the internet is so big, which in 1998 it wasn't as much, so we were able to refer a lot of the content to the website, which would also appeal to younger readers who go there oftentimes as a first source for information. So you'll see throughout the book that there are references to the website, and the website, the additional content is really exceptional. But on the website, the content that I produced was related to our specific health concerns, looking at heterosexist assumptions and homophobia and transphobia in medical settings, and then what we can do about those particular problems, and the issue of coming out to our healthcare providers and how that affects the care that we get, and finally how to find an LGBTI-friendly healthcare provider. So I think I've covered quite a bit for now, and I'll pass it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I just want to add that the new website is also very pretty. Is it still BW? No. It's ourbodiesourselves.org. And this is our web mistress right here. Right there. Kiki. Okay. Thank you, Kiki. Next up, we have Hawk. Moonhawk River Stone is a psychotherapist, consultant, educator, and author in private practice in the Albany, New York area, and is himself an out, open, and proud transsexual man. In his clinical practice, Mr. Stone has specialized in working with the LGBT community, especially with transgender people of all ages and their families, with survivors of childhood trauma and people with dissociative disorders for over 16 years. He has presented hundreds of workshops and trainings at numerous conferences, both locally and nationally, and both academic and clinical, on many topics, but specializes in transgender education. Stone is a political activist for transgender civil rights. He's on the board. He is the board chair of the International Foundation for Gender Education, IFGE, and the board co-chair of the New York Association for Gender Rights Advocacy, Inc., Niagara. I love acronyms. Stone recently presented scholarly papers include Gender Identity is for Everyone, Creating a Paradigm for Change at the Manchester, UK 6th International Congress on Sex and Gender Diversity, Reflecting Genders, September 2004, and Approaching Critical Mass, an exploration of the role of intersex allies in creating positive education, advocacy, and change at the Intersex Education, Advocacy, and the Law Symposium, sponsored by the Cardozo Women's Law Journal and Bodies Like Ours, February 2005 in New York, New York. And here is Hawk.
Thank you all very, very much for having me here. I really appreciate this opportunity to be here this evening, and appreciate so very, very much the very long and wonderful work of the Boston Women's Health Collective in doing this very, very important work. I came to my transness through being a lesbian, through being active in women's health in my own community, and know from having passed this book to many clients over many editions for many years how important it is in our lives. And I really just want to thank everybody for that, the long work that you have done. For myself, that I'm going to speak a little this evening about trans health concerns would be the first thing, and the second thing would be F2M health concerns a little bit, and the second thing will be about a new exciting project that I'm getting underway with some good buddies of mine. So the first thing I'd like to say is that for F2Ms, it's wonderful that we are included in this edition of Our Bodies Ourselves, and that we can see that it is important because we are coming from femaleness towards masculinity, that we can have access to information, to resources that will help us with our health care. F2M healthcare needs are many and huge. We have issues about coming out across the lifespan. We have issues around those of us who choose to take testosterone, that hormones are not yet are used off market for people. They're not used. There's no research that exists yet around the long-term efficacy of hormones and dosages and things that we have to use. There's need for that research, and I think we need to really recognize the full spectrum of masculinities. And I think Our Bodies Ourselves does a really good job of recognizing that and how important that is in our involving community, not only here in America, but in the world. We know there are many places in the world where the gender spectrum is what is usual, and sort of transsexualism as we know it is sort of unusual. So that's really important. I think as a healthcare issue and a healthcare provider, I think one of the things we need to be aware of is the stress that transphobia and homophobia place on us, and that the healthcare problems we have as a result of that, and the mental health issues we may have as a result of that. I have been part of working with the National Coalition for LGBT Health. I am co-chair with Jessica Xavier of the Ending Disparities Committee there. And there's some stuff in the back for you. That there's these sheets we put together on trans healthcare and guide to wellness that are available in public domain for anybody, and they for trans men and trans women. And they really are really good quick guides to what trans men need to know about good health care. I think, too, it's really difficult. This edition talks about access to health care. And for trans people, access to health care, I think, is really tricky because often our health care is not covered by insurance or health care plans. It's often explicitly excluded from Medicare and Medicaid health plans. And it's also health care providers are not trained to work with trans bodies. And in thinking about, because some of us may want to access medical care but not be able to access medical care, our bodies are often an amalgam, meaning that we have both masculinity and femininity existing within our body. And whatever body parts we have, we need to access proper health care for those body parts. And finding physicians flexible enough to deal with those issues and open enough to deal with those issues is very difficult, and part of the advocacy work that I do in many different issues. In terms of F2Ms and available medical service, wherever I travel in healthcare conferences, one of the workshops I provide for F2Ms is a workshop on sexuality, where we get to sit in a room with confidentiality and talk about anything we'd like to talk about sexuality. And coming out from that is the idea that lower surgery for F2Ms is still very imperfect, still fraught with a lot of complications and difficult times, and we need to work hard to change that. And then I think, too, the whole issue of, and Gordine may touch on this, is about gender identity disorder in the DSM, and the fact that I'm one of the people advocating for its removal. But again, that is a whole nest of problems about that. How do we access health care if we do that? But I think, F2Ms need readily accessible health care information, and and we also need to understand that for many of us who are somewhere on the gender spectrum, we still have health care needs that are really specific to our also female bodies, and how important that is. And the last thing I'm going to mention is to talk very briefly about is there's an article here that we did, an overview of trans health priorities, which is in the back. And the last little bit that I'm going to mention very quickly is with Jessica Xavier, who is not able to be here tonight, who I want to honor for all the work she has done in our community, and that I am attempting very humbly to fill those shoes by being here instead of her this evening, is that we have begun working on a collective modeled after the Boston Women's Health Collective to produce a volume called Our Trans Bodies that we are hoping will come out sometime in the next 3 to 5 years with a lot of hard work. And she and I are the initiators of this grand idea, and we're working very hard to get it off the ground. And probably you'll be hearing more from us as we contact people and get rolling and float out chapter designs and those kinds of things. And so I would like to say thank you very much, and I'm very open to your feedback and questions you may have later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hawk. And last but most certainly not least, we're going to get to hear from Gordine McKenzie, who's a longtime activist and professor and director of the Women's Studies program at Merrimack College in North Andover, Mass., where she teaches courses on gender, film, and popular culture, masculinity studies, and global women's issues. She developed and taught the first transgender studies course at the University of New Mexico in the early 1990s. She's the author of Transgender Nation and many articles. She co-founded and facilitated the first transgender and cross-dresser support group in New Mexico in the early 80s. Gordine produces and co-hosts Gender Talk Radio, which you should all listen to. It's really great, with her life partner Nancy Nangeroni, who is also the founder of Gender Talk and happens to be here with us tonight as well. Gordine.
Thank you very much. I've had the pleasure to have grown up with our bodies ourselves. In the 70s, I was so excited. I was like, yeehaw, here's a roadmap for my body, and none of the medical professionals are going to tell me what to do with it anymore. And I remember bringing it with me to gynecologists and all kinds of things, and I was very proud. I recently bought a copy of Our Bodies Ourselves for my women's studies students, and it has been taken out all the time. They're checking it out, and one of them just told me, hey, my mom gave me a copy from the 70s, and I'm so excited. And I'm excited tonight and want to thank everyone, Heather, everyone on the panel, Kiki for the website, and all of you that have worked very hard. Esther, Nancy, I know we're post readers. You actually wrote, Esther, and Nancy and I were post readers for the section on gender identity, and how nice to see that section really, really expanding and getting large. What I'd like to kind of focus on are some maybe footnotes in terms of how we look at trans bodies and how trans bodies are made invisible in our culture. Hawk talked a little bit about doctors' insensitivity, also doctors' refusal to treat some trans bodies. Many of you have maybe seen the film Southern Comfort by Kate Davis, in which Robert Eads, a trans man, dies of ovarian cancer because he went to over 22 physicians who refused to treat him and would not let him in the office. There's so many issues. Leslie Feinberg has written about being left out in hallways with no one to treat her for anything because people laughed at her body. And Tyra Hunter, as many of you know the story of being in a terrible accident in Washington, D.C., and when the paramedics were cutting Tyra's clothing off and discovered Tyra was a woman that happened to have a penis, stopped working and decided to make jokes instead, and Tyra died, and there are many people who said that Tyra could have been saved. There's so many issues. Hawk touched on some in terms of where's the research on hormones that we desperately need. Recently, I had a friend that had been on Prozac, a trans man, for a number of years, and he started having a lot of suicide ideation and ended up making an attempt on his life. One of the things that came out of that was a conversation on, okay, we know that sometimes kids on Prozac are suicidal. What about trannies that are taking hormones? Are there any correlations? Are there any studies being done on that? Surgical complications also that Hawk mentioned before. We sometimes don't think of really simple things. For example, if you had breast implants, certain kinds of breast implants, and if you have a mammogram, it can really set off bad things and damage your breast for something as simple as trying to take care of your health. Historically, there were very different ideas about trans people than we have today. The idea was that all trans people were basically MTFs and were surgery bound and were all heterosexual. And If you look at the Harry Benjamin book, one of the things that Harry Benjamin, which became the transsexual Bible, advised was you forget about your past. You move to a new town. You don't ever tell anyone any of your history at all, which we know is an incredibly damaging, horrible thing. It reminds me of Native Americans who during relocation were dropped in cities in the 30s and the 40s with no support system whatsoever, and you expect people to be able to fare. Complications on estrogen. One of our staff members on Gender Talk developed a blood clot. No one is really doing a lot of work in that either. Anytime you have a stigmatized minority, you have problems of self-stigmatization. You have problems around substance abuse, HIV rates, very high, yet the CDC really hasn't looked at transgender people as a separate class, although there are a number of groups now, and I'm sure your group as well, trying to get attention, so there can be special pamphlets written for trans bodies. We've come a long way from surgeons saying we're going to give surgery so we can make people into good citizens, so at least they'll be heterosexual. Our thinking has changed a lot, and we certainly see more identities emerging. We see 50 billion galaxies of gender, or maybe not all of them yet, but they're out there, and there's probably a lot more than that. But I just wanted to thank everyone for the work they've done and have us all think really, really hard about some of these issues so none of our brothers or sisters are ever made invisible, are ever turned away, or ever are victims of hate crimes because some bodies just aren't tolerated. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So that's just like a little taste of what's in the new book and all the thinking that's gone into it and the activists and wonderful people behind the book. But one of the really beautiful things about our bodies ourselves, especially, we host a lot of book events, and most of the time when you have a book event, the book's finished, right? So you don't get to give feedback about how you'd like the book to change and grow and address your needs better. But that's not ever true about our bodies ourselves. And so one of the beautiful things about it is we constantly can create it. And so what we'd like to do now is have that community conversation. Start now by talking about what do you think about the new edition, how is it going to serve your needs, what are the issues you're interested in, so that we can start creating that information now. So what we're going to ask you to do really briefly is pair up with someone near you. Could be someone you know. This isn't a forced mixer. And we're just going to give you two really brief questions for you to spend just a couple of minutes talking about, just to get you thinking, get you talking, and then we're going to open it up and have a larger conversation. So just take a second and identify someone near you that you can chat with and introduce yourself to them if you don't know them. If they're unmatched people, yeah, good. Is there anyone unmatched? You can also do threes. Does anyone want to talk with this lovely young woman in the red sweater right here? Can you pair up with it right over here? Perfect. Super. Okay, so the first question. All right, now don't get carried away. I don't have to encourage you to talk very much. The first question to talk about is, what are the health issues that you're most concerned about? This doesn't have to be about your own personal health, but what are the health issues that you're concerned about making sure that we address in our bodies ourselves and that get addressed by the medical establishment? That what are the health issues that you think are most important for us to talk about tonight? Go. We're talking. That's great. So I'm just going to throw this in the hopper while you're talking to talk about, for those of you who've grown up with our bodies ourselves, how you think the new information and new format will impact you or people you care about. For those of you who maybe have just come to Our Bodies Ourselves, or for whom this is not, the 43rd edition. Well, I was actually just saying to Wendy, if I can share, it really struck me while listening to everyone talking how I didn't ever, when I discovered Our Bodies Ourselves, my reaction wasn't, oh my gosh, it's a roadmap for my body, because I already had access to that information. And that's because of the work that that a lot of people up here and in the audience have been doing over that time. So we come at this all from different perspectives. So the question to discuss now is, how do the changes in the new edition, as you've heard about them, how do you think they'll impact you and the communities and people you care about, and what other kinds of changes would you like to see happen in the future? A larger conversation now that you're warmed up. But before we do that, I do want to mention that there are some other folks who are crucial to the production of this and previous Our Bodies Ourselves who are here in the room tonight. Saray Walker, who's the photo editor. Can you stand? Where is she? There she is. Heather Stevenson, a managing editor. Where's Heather? And Joan Ditzione, who's a founder of Our Bodies Ourselves and revised the Growing Older chapter. And we may be missing people. Are there any other people in the room who've worked on this edition or any other editions of Our Bodies Ourselves? Stand up. Stand up so we can cheer for you. Yeah. Thank you. Our humble, humble gratitude. Okay, so now this is a big open conversation. You can ask questions of the panelists. You can ask questions at large. You can make comments and statements, give suggestions, whatever it is that you would like to say or discuss. This is the time. My only request is that you speak into the microphone so that we can all hear you. So I'm going to be a little Oprah-like in that sense. Here I come, because we only have one microphone tonight. So Great. And also if you can say your name.
My name's Carrie Percival. My question is for you, Wendy. I heard that Our Bodies Ourselves originally was, the people that were working on it originally were partly influenced through reevaluation counseling. Was that true? Have you heard of that? Yeah, reevaluation, co-counseling, yeah. No. So I'm just wondering, to what extent is that still true, or are people still using RC as an activist tool, since it kind of came out of that time period of finding a way for people to have a voice and find their political strength in discharging feelings that are in the way of getting them what they need, blah, blah, blah.
Thanks, Carrie. There may be people here who could speak about reevaluation counseling more than I can. I think we were more influenced by leftist politics and by work in the civil rights movement. I don't remember anyone in the original several editions speaking about RC much. So, but is there anyone else here who knows differently? I mean, we had some strong influences, but I think they were the left, the civil rights movement.
I just wanted to recognize Esther Morris, who is an intersex activist who has done some tremendous work and also wrote part of the piece on intersex in Our Bodies Ourselves. And maybe, Esther, you might want to say a couple words.
Thank you, Gordine. I did want to mention that the In America They Call Us section is alive and well. It is being quoted in the current edition. It's a piece written by Angela Marino called In America They Call Us Hermaphrodites, and that has been quoted and cited in the recent piece that we just did. The thing about intersex that I think is really pertinent for an edition in Our Bodies, Ourselves, and Women's Health is the extreme example that medicine and social pressure have to normalize women's bodies and everybody's bodies in terms of what we're supposed to be as opposed to who we really are. And also to remind everybody that in one way or another we are all judged. Some people pass and some people don't. So hopefully we can keep that in mind. It's really great to have intersex included in this edition, and hopefully that contribution can grow as Our Bodies, Ourselves continues to grow.
Thanks.
My name's Jacqueline. I was the editor for the 2 medical chapters in this edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves. One of the things I was concerned to do was to address conditions that affect everybody but affect women differently than they affect men. And for that goal, I wanted to include the risks of cardiovascular disease and cancer as they affected trans people, because trans people are not only taking hormones, which increase the risk of both of these kinds of diseases, but also may not have the body parts, internal and external, that they still have adequately treated and examined by medical practitioners. And I think that my attitude about this was generated by something that went way farther back than this edition. The late Andrea Dworkin, whom I happen to know personally, addressed the question of the construction of both gender and biological sex, basing her articulation of these issues on the work of John Money of Johns Hopkins, who studied intersexed people. And she pointed out in a book that was published in 1984 that even biological sex is not defined absolutely for all time by nature, but is really a construct of 6 or 7 different external and internal characteristics of which only genital sex is used to define a person socially at birth and governs the way this baby is treated. Then if the other things manifest themselves later, depending on whether there's parental panic, mental problems, social dysfunction or whatever, the person may be pressured into going toward one end of the spectrum or the other. And I think that's really important, because what it suggests to me is that all of us, no matter how we identify biologically or by gender or by relationships, need to be aware that what's on the outside may not tell every practitioner we consult what's on the inside, and that if they don't find what we're suffering from right away, they'd better test for something else, and we need to know what that range is so that we can nudge them. And I hope that what we've done in this edition, pointing up some of these issues, will have repercussions and carry over into more work in the next edition. Thanks.
Thank you.
I was wondering, since I hadn't heard anything specific addressed by the panel, if it was something that is addressed in the areas that you're talking about. In terms of biphobia, I heard people talk about homophobia and transphobia, but if biphobia within the community is addressed at all. And also, are bi women discussed and sharing their own stories in a very distinctive way, and not just lumping lesbian and bi women together and really seeing their concerns and their health issues separately.
Hi, and I actually apologize for not mentioning that, because biphobia and bisexual women are included in my chapter. It's only about 13 pages, and I had to describe all of sexual orientation and gender identity in 13 pages. But I definitely have a section in Chapter 9 if you want to check it out, and there are quotes by women. It's separate from the lesbian section. It's separate from the trans section. And definitely I heard from many bisexual women from all over wanting to share their stories. And I know Shannon once talked about it too in her chapter. So.
thanks for asking that. Yes, there are voices throughout that are from people who identify as bisexual. And one of the things I didn't say when I was talking before was how, I guess, surprised I was by the number of responses that I got from people with their personal stories. We hear about, Elizabeth and I were talking about the idea of LGBT communities or community. There being, one is sort of how we sort of our community, but that there are so many communities, and that what was so amazing to me is that I had reached out through friends, through organizations, through listservs, and went very specifically to listservs that serve specific communities or populations, and regardless of age. I mean, there were, from 18 to, I think 60s was the oldest that was identified. In my call on email, I self-identified as, at the time, 31-year-old queer, urban white woman. And so that's kind of where I started. And so other people identified themselves based on any number of categories. And so you really knew who these were coming from. But it was, race. We were talking about a spectrum of sexual orientation or gender identity. There were people who, were in relationships, were not in relationships, were polyamorous, class variety of people from different classes. I was really surprised. I think you'll see that reflected in the pages and also on the website, that there really are a variety of experiences that show that it's far beyond what this room is, and there are many communities even within this room. So I think it's very exciting to see that we're part of something so much bigger. But yes, there are bi voices, and even though I'm bisexual, I was reminded that there needed to be more. So it's something good to be aware of. Thanks for bringing that up.
Lynn Rosenbaum, who couldn't be here tonight because she's teaching a class, is the person who wrote the sexuality chapter. And she's also quite active in bi circles in the Boston area, so that's another strength of the book.
I apologize. I've forgotten your name already. Blonde-haired woman sitting next to you. Jackie? I'm hearing impaired. Jackie? Jack. Okay. I wanted to comment a little bit on what you were saying about trans health and hormones and issues. Is it Louis Gorens who is responsible for providing a lot of care and a lot of research in the Netherlands, and has very good access to the data because of the healthcare system in the Netherlands? He's done a 25-year morbidity and mortality retrospective study on hormones and found that people, both male and female, transgender people, don't go on to any increased morbidity and mortality due to taking hormones. But what I would say in my clinical practice, what I have observed is that when people are moving across the gender divide, is that if their biological parent, and say their father, and they're moving from femaleness to maleness, carries a gene about a particular illness, I will ask that person to watch out for that much more carefully, because I've seen enough anecdotal cases in my practice that there's something that happens on the testosterone that switches that on sometimes, which is so. I do, yes. Yeah, I do. There's this specific type of breast cancer that is very gene-related. My niece, unfortunately, has a mother and a sister-in-law who have that. And when I hear of men moving from masculinity to femininity, and that exists elsewhere with their female siblings or their mothers, I ask them to make sure they get the mammograms, because I suspect that that's what we'll be finding. I mean, I've had some anecdotal evidence about that. So it's more, I think, those kinds of good healthcare preventive things about if you are now as female, you need to get those things done.
In the back.
Hi, I'm Liz, and I have a list of questions, so I'm going to go through them really quickly, and if you don't get to answering all of them, that's fine. It's just stuff I wanted to throw out there. One of the things I have questions about, it's all about health and safety and trans issues. One of them is around traveling and being trans and safety around that. Traveling in countries where, I've traveled with somebody who's trans and pat downs at security in different places, just a very unsafe situation. I'm just wondering if that's something that's covered or if there are resources around that anywhere. I'm wondering if there are resources or if there's been any research done around binding and athletics and safety issues around that. I have, on some of the handouts back there, there's something about mental health and the importance of how a mental health therapist can really help you deal with things. And I'm just wondering if there are any concrete, practical resources around identifying not just trans-friendly but trans-competent therapists. And if any exists. And, if there are resources around, either getting referrals, getting, good referrals for trans competent therapists, also if there are resources around kind of questions to ask to kind of screen therapists. And then also I'm wondering if there's any documented kind of insurance battles around people whose, there isn't someone covered within their insurance who's trans competent, but they find someone else who is, and kind of making a case for the insurance having a responsibility to make sure that you have a provider that's really meeting your needs. So I'm wondering if there's anything around that. And just my last question was around, are there good writings around kind of moving forward with embracing masculinity while still being reflective about and rejecting male privilege? So kind of balancing those two things. Sorry for my question.
Who wants to start?
The National Center for Transgender Equality, who has an odd website name that I'm having a senior moment about. Thank you, Nancy, very much. On their website is a very good downloadable piece about traveling safely. I will share personally that I went to my personal physician when they were doing this new fluoroscope machine in Orlando doing these tests a couple of years ago. And I said to him, I pack, and I'm not going to have lower surgery, and I just really don't want some uneducated TSA folks to think I'm carrying some C4 onto the airplane and have to spend a lot of time explaining why that's in my pants. So he wrote me up a nice little letter that I actually composed and said that I travel with a prosthesis and it's for medical care, and that's what it is, and don't be bothered with me, essentially, or call him. He'll be very glad to get on the phone with TSA and explain to them why I'm packing. And that is something that I decided to do coming from Spencer Bergstadt, is that his correct name? Who is an attorney in Seattle, Washington, who deals with a lot of this stuff, and he's very good. Binding, there's some anecdotal evidence about people who bind too tight for too long degenerate breast tissue, and that's not good for chest surgery. So I encourage people to remain unbound at least 12 hours a day, in much the same way I encourage people who wear bras to remain unbrad about 12 hours a day. Mental health issues, I don't know what to say. Fenway folks might know some trans-competent therapists in the area. There's one in Albany, New York. Insurance battles, I don't know, maybe Gordine has something, and maybe Gordine has something about the masculinity writing. I'm not really aware of that. So
I know it's a discussion in the community very much in terms of how do we embrace masculinity but not all of a sudden move into a patriarchal male privilege position and start treating women like pigs. It's a very, very active discussion. I can't think of anything written at this point. Can you, Huck? No. Yeah. I know we talk about it all the time, but yeah. And we could definitely think about it a little bit more. Trans-competent therapists, not trans-friendly. That's a really, really big issue. In fact, my partner has written on that. Do you want to take that one, Nancy?
I actually want to say something about the masculinity, not male privilege issue before, and I'm going to hand it over, which is to say that I know that the Boston chapter of the National Organization of Men Against Sexism, NOMAS, has a number of trans men as members currently, and they're actually starting to have this conversation among them, both between sort of, factory direct men and trans men. So I don't know where you can find writings, but if you're in Boston and want to hook up with NOMAS, they're engaging that conversation. Oh yeah, and this great book that I have a piece in, and Gordine, called "Pinned Down by Pronouns," has some great writings about gender and privilege.
Well, maybe I won't stick the camera on myself for this. Anyway, finding competent therapists is one of my pet peeves. I worked on a piece for the National Health Workers Society, National Social Workers at NSWA, I think it was. So this National Association of Social Workers, which is what a lot of our therapists are. They're social workers, and they get their license to be social workers. Anyway, I worked on their trans piece, and that inspired me to write this piece called Ethics in Transgender Care. And we have a big problem with ethical therapists. There are a lot of therapists out there who are preying on the transgender community. Some, I don't think any of them realize they're doing it. And so it's a major buyer beware situation, one that really deserves more looking into. A lot of therapists just don't know what constitutes ethical practice. And I talked with the people at the national organization, and they gave me the guidelines, and I went down them. Yep, they're violating this one and this one and this one. Okay. I know somebody who is in jail for murder. I'll shorten this. I'm sorry. This is a person who went to a therapist after recovering from alcoholism that was brought on by their gender issues. Went to a therapist. The therapist convinced this poor person that, what you need is a good woman, and I'm that woman. They ended up married. They both had tempers, apparently. They ended up fighting. Therapist threw boiling water on the tranny. The tranny told me in a letter from jail that her wife came at her with a knife. She blacked out. Next thing she knew, she was in jail for murdering her wife. So there's some really seriously bad stuff out there that's happening because of unethical therapists. It's an area that really needs some serious cleanup and deserves some more writing.
I have a dear friend that is a trans man that has worked in health care and specifically in counseling that made a comment to us a while back, and he said that for so long we were just so desperate to have any friends that we let anyone into our community. And some of the people that were let into the community tended to be very predatory and did not have any boundaries. And there are a number of people who can address very intense horror stories around that. So I was really pleased that you were saying not trans-friendly, but trans-competent, because that's incredibly important. One of the things in terms of asking is, who have you treated? How many people have you treated? What is your approach? Is it just a cookie cutter approach? Is everyone that's coming out gonna seek the same solutions? Or are you willing to listen and realize that there are a lot of different places that people are going to fall on the gender circle? And just really talk about boundary issues as well. I think with your therapist is incredibly important.
One last comment is that I do teach a consumer side workshop called Navigating the Land of Therapy 101, which takes people in about an hour and a half through a thorough how to find a therapist, how to find a competent therapist, and then a competent gender therapist from a proactive consumer-based thing. So there are resources out there.
I want to take one moment to acknowledge that Judy Norsegian has joined us, one of the founders of Our Bodies Ourselves, and on the editing team for the new edition. So, we called everybody out. We're not treating you special. She's our staff photographer for the night. Did you have a question or comment? Or?
My name is Catherine Kravitz. Great. Okay. As we discuss the gender spectrum and how it's not necessarily two discrete groups, we've talked about men and women, we've talked about intersex, we've talked about how sexuality on a gender scale can land really anywhere, and then there was a description of a circle, which is lovely and even more interesting than a spectrum in a lot of ways. So my question is, whereas bisexuality refers to the to root of the prefix bi, where is the future of that word going now that gender, A, and sex are much more than just a bipolar entity?
I have a trans partner, and I identify as flexisexual. Flexisexual. It's just a proposition. I've been partnered with people of lots of different genders, and I agree, like, bisexuality doesn't feel quite right for me. And that's a word, I think it came up in a conversation I was having with some friends, and I was like, I kind of like that. So I don't know if other people have other suggestions. Well, queer, yes.
Well, anything that means all. So pan, omni, I mean, like, is that a...
Hello? Oh. I read a story about another woman who's with a trans person, and actually this was related to the question I had to ask too, who identified as transensual, which is another interesting word. But, okay, here's another question then. So we have these great terms, but, like, how do I talk to my mom about this? That's what I want to know. Because my mom knows the word lesbian, and she knows the word straight, and after that, we get into really murky territory, and she doesn't like it. So if anybody has any suggestions, I would love to hear them. But I was also wondering what kind of resources are in the book, because I haven't been able to read the newest edition yet, but for partners of trans people, partners and allies and friends, but people who are trying to really actively support the trans community, in all kinds of different circumstances. So just kind of generally to both of those points, I think that language is obviously a really very personal thing, and so even in looking at how we're going to refer to ourselves, or even the title for the chapter, Relationships with Women, it's parallel to relationships with men, but of course that's very problematic because, we can identify as bisexual. Anyway, so our concerns need to be dealt with in both chapters, for those of us who are bisexual, which they are, and transgender voices are included in both chapters. But the use of the word queer, basically we use either LBT, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, within the relationships with women chapter, or the word queer to be sort of more encompassing. And I know that I'd maybe be interested in hearing from Wendy if she feels like adding to this, but that I think, younger generations are more comfortable with the word queer. some absolutely aren't. When I came to talk a little bit about our bodies ourselves at the LGBTI Health Summit in August, there were people who were all over the map whether they were okay with that word or not okay with that word. And so that was even a very interesting conversation on its own and not separated by generation or anything like that. But to speak to the thing about what do you say your parents, coming out to my parents as bisexual, of course, was very confusing for them. But actually I prefer to identify as queer, but for some reason I can't sort of say that to them. So we all have I thought bisexual sounds more normal. I don't know. So anyway, it's I think an issue for many of us.
Thanks for those questions. These are issues that I think about all the time. I think it's really interesting. I also have a trans partner, and I identify as a dyke, and I think it's really interesting to see the many ways that people identify. Something that came up for me when I was writing my chapter is I write, all about how there's many genders and genders and galaxies of gender, which is something that Gordine first came up with, and then I start talking about bisexuality, and that there's a major disconnect there. So I would love to hear from the audience more if anyone has other ideas. I talk about pansexual. I don't really know that many people who use that term, pansexual. I'm not really sure in what communities it's more prevalent. I know in my communities my community of color in Philadelphia, that's not a word that's used. So I'm all up for new language, and definitely, I also use the word queer, which is also problematic, again, with people from different generations, and people of different races, ethnicities don't feel comfortable using that word. So I didn't really answer any question, but I appreciate these questions because it's really something that I think about every day. And in terms of talking to your parents, I just try to break everything down for my mom. I'm just like, this is what that means, it's hard. Sometimes I don't think she knows what I'm talking about, but she just smiles and pretends like she does. So.
I don't want to lose the question about are there resources for partners and friends and family of trans people. And the great thing about having a web companion is whatever we come up with here doesn't have to wait till the next print book. So it's a really important question, so I'll pass it on.
Does anyone in the audience have resources?
Before we go to that, I did want to say one thing that when we're looking in the chapter on relationships with women, there is a section really looking at finding our communities, and there are some resources in that section about for people with trans partners. And I think that it would be great to do more for the companion website and to hear from other people.
Hi, I'm Mary. I wanted to say there is a website, butchdykeboy.com, on which there is a partners column, which is called something, I can't remember what it's called, but anyway, it's by a partner of a trans person, and on her column is a link to a Yahoo support group for partners and friends of trans people. With a Y. It's with a Y, and it's all one word. And I also I have the mic, can I just tell a little story? I was talking to my partner back there, my conversation partner, about of answering the questions. Anyways, okay, am I on TV? I came across Our Bodies Ourselves, I think it was the second one in 1974 when I was 12, and I grew up in Canada. And so the chapter in America, they call us dykes, was illuminating for me because it made me sort of understand what I was feeling about one of my best friends, but it also made me feel like, okay, well, I got to go to the States to get some of this to happen for me, because I didn't see anything like that in my neighborhood. And so it's kind of ironic that I ended up in Boston, where a lot of things have happened for me. But in my adult life, I've met some people who I told them where I come from, which is Halifax, and they said, oh, I was in Halifax in 1976, and we went to the public gardens, and we saw these dykes, and we met up with them, and we went to this bar, and I didn't know they were there. I didn't know they were there. Anyways, I just wanted to share that little anecdote. And thanks for all your work, everything. Should I pass this?
P flag for the families of trans people? Right on.
Which is now going out of print, but it's in a downloadable PDF on the website. Mary Benke, who has been producing them and doing that, is just elderly and tired, and so she's not going to print them anymore. And she's sort of having a sale on them right now to get rid of her stock. But TNET, it's TNET as part of PFLAG, deals with parents and with children, and also trans families of Cleveland. Karen Gross is also a wonderful resource.
And you can actually hear interviews with these folks and find links to other groups that talk about trans partners on www.gendertalk.com, and you can hear those interviews live. Pardon me? Yeah, there's a reading list on there as well.
In the back.
Great. I get to ask a question now. I'm curious how the issues of being bisexual and finding community and being bisexual and being bisexual within the larger GLBT community and the biphobia that exists, if and how those are addressed in the book.
Thanks for, okay. So, we talked a little bit about that, and I think that I didn't in particular use the word biphobia in the piece in particular about in either the relationships chapter or the health concerns material that's on the website. And I think that was important for me to hear today, and I know with all the people who reviewed it, I don't think I really heard that word used, and so I think that's an important word to use. And in my mind, I think it was homophobia was encompassing, but I really want to acknowledge that I hear that being said today, and that's definitely something that that's now more in my awareness, I guess. But throughout both the relationships with men chapter and relationships with women chapter, again, there are bisexual women who've spoken out about their experiences, and I think that within the context of many different subjects, those experiences are explored. So through all the relationship issues that are picked up, those voices are included. So I think after more people have seen that, I would love any feedback, and I know Our Bodies Ourselves would appreciate any feedback. I mean, the book is a very stable thing, but the website less so, and I'm open to, expanding material. Kiki might, be kind of tired of me, but definitely, we can continue to make it better, and that's true of anyone who's here after you look at the material. I would really appreciate your feedback. Thanks.
Me too. We're just going to take 2 more questions or comments, and then our panelists are going to get a chance to have a quick last comment, and then we'll do evaluations. Kiki.
I just wanted to quickly say that if people want to give feedback to lots of different revisers, wrote lots of different content pieces that are on the companion website. And if anyone wants to give feedback specifically to them, you can click there's a little button at the bottom of the web page that says feedback, www.outofbodiesourselves.org, that says feedback. And if you say anywhere in your note that you specifically like this person who wrote the particular material to get your email, we will make sure that they get that.
Thank you. Who's got one last question or comment? Over here.
It's Catherine again. I'm a little bit of a language fanatic, and whereas bi means something very specific to me, and I feel like every time we say bi, we exclude people. it also occurred to me that every time we say he or she, we exclude people. And I haven't read that chapter yet, so that may have been addressed. But just the variety of ways that people address that spectrum in pronouns, and which I know I'm sure you know exists, like the Z, and then there's other options like that. But I just wanted to put that out there, that if you haven't included that would be great for next time. There is stuff. The best. Good work.
Well, you all have this has been a great conversation. I want to encourage you all to continue it even after the formal part of the presentation is done. But before that happens, we're going to turn to our fabulous panelists and ask for some last quick thoughts or comments or anything.
Well, I guess this evening shows, for me, why it's been such a privilege to be involved in this book for 35 years. These are good topics, and I think the book will change because of it, so thank you.
Just wanted to thank everyone for coming out. It's been really wonderful to talk to you all, and feel free to ask me any other questions or suggestions. So thanks again.
I also want to thank everyone, and I appreciate the work that each of you is doing individually to, I guess, put more out there about our health concerns, as varied as they are, and doing what you can to help people find the answers, in the medical care field, and, sharing resources among ourselves. Thanks.
I want to say thank you. I feel very honored to have been here tonight, and I also am really enthused by people's comments and questions and suggestions in the conversation. It really means a lot to me and tickles my brain in wonderful ways, and I know will help not only my endeavors, but the endeavors with Our Bodies Ourselves keep making the book just more and more. Thank you very much.
I want to say thanks, and what a strength for collaboration, and what a wonderful model to have so many people cooking and working on all these great ideas. And just beware to all of us that we're in times where things are changing very quickly and in many, many good ways in the area of our bodies and sex and gender. But we're also in times, because that change is happening, it's backlash times too, and we have to be careful, particularly in the area of transgender, which is the area I'm most familiar with, of people like Bailey or Blanchard at Clark that are really pandering to really transphobic and homophobic things, and we have to be alert because they're using those things in Psychology 101 classes, and it's really good to have a place where we can refer people to say, oh, but that's not true. They're giving you misinformation, and now you can go somewhere and get something very different, and thank you all.
Can we have a big thank you for our panelists and all their contributions? Thank you so much.